All right, so buckle up, listeners, because today's deep dive, well, it's a wild one.
Mm-hmm.
We're diving into, get this, an article called Universal Suffrage is a Suicide Pact.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, catchy title, right?
It definitely grabs your attention.
John Carter, that's our author. It really makes you think.
Yeah.
So we'll unpack his arguments, see if they, actually hold water.
Yeah, and what's really unsettling, at least to me, is how Carter ties voting rights to, well, violence.
It's like he's saying it's not about peaceful debate, but who's got the bigger stick, right?
Yeah, basically. He goes way back in history for this. Ancient Greece, Rome, even the Vikings. He argues for centuries voting tied directly to fighting.
Right, like only the strong get a say,
Right.
or something like that.
Yeah, and he even quotes, I think it's Robert Heinlein, the sci-fi author, saying violence is the supreme authority, and like everything else comes from that.
It's a bit intense, isn't it? Like something out of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, definitely a bit much for, modern democracy.
But then he brings up firearms.
Yep.
And this is where it gets interesting.
This is the twist, right? He's saying firearms kind of leveled the playing field. When anyone with a musket could take on a knight, well, that changed who had military power.
And that's what led to more people getting the vote, according to him.
That's his argument. Not because of some ideal of equality, but because the common man, so to speak, now had some real power.
So he's saying it wasn't about ideals, but about adapting to a new reality?
Yeah. And Carter, he doesn't see that as a good thing. He uses terms like the pernicious fiction of universal equality. Like we've taken this whole equal voting thing way too far.
Okay, so we're starting to see where this is headed. He connects voting and violence, but then he turns to the present, and, well, that's where things get really interesting and a little unnerving.
Exactly. Because now he's saying these same forces that expanded voting rights, they're pushing Western democracies towards, like, a crisis point.
And, I mean, he doesn't mince words when describing today's political landscape.
He does not.
He claims the left, they use immigration to get more voters. He even calls immigrants client groups. And these groups, he says, they're kept on the left side with social programs, all funded by, and this is where it gets really pointed, taxing the native population.
Yeah, and it's important to point out here that Carter's language, like native population and client groups, is very loaded, oversimplifies a really complex issue.
For sure. We're not endorsing his views here, just trying to understand them.
Exactly, and what Carter's getting at, I think, is this idea of one group pitted against another, those who contribute to society, at least in his view, versus those who benefit without contributing equally. And he's saying, basically, this is bad for Western civilization.
And it all comes back to violence. He's essentially saying that the group he sees as more capable and willing to use force, and he's very clearly implying this is the native right-leaning population, they're being outmaneuvered in a system where their votes are outnumbered.
Exactly. Like democracy itself is working against them, according to him. It's a deeply unsettling argument.
It really is. Makes you think about representation, power, even the nature of democracy itself.
It does. And what's even wilder is Carter doesn't stop at just critiquing the system. He actually offers a solution.
Oh, and what's that?
Well, let's just say it's a tad different from what we've got going on now. It's almost like Carter's, take this idea of skin in the game, something you usually hear about, like investing.
Right.
But he's applying it to voting. Those with the most to lose, the ones HE sees as invested in the nation's future, well, they should have more say, he argues.
And he seems to equate most to lose with a capacity for violence. I'm not sure I follow that connection.
Yeah, it's definitely a dangerous argument. We should be clear about that. But even disagreeing with his solution, which I think most people would, he's poking at some uncomfortable stuff. Like, who really has power in a democracy? And can a system like ours, can it be gamed,
One thing that jumped out at me was how much Carter focuses on demographics. Like, he claims the left, they gain power by importing client groups and then showering them with resources. Even calls it a coalition of parasitism, which is, well, something.
Right. Incredibly inflammatory. You got to acknowledge that. This is like super simplistic, dividing everyone into two camps when it's way more complex than that. But if we're going to try to understand him, I think he's saying mass immigration, especially tied to one political side, it creates imbalances, right? Tensions in a society.
And he uses California as, like, Exhibit A. Once Republican, then Reagan's amnesty happens, boom, flips Democrat. And he claims they've been using immigration to stay in power ever since.
California has changed a lot demographically. And not just them, but, lots of the West, whether it's deliberate, like Carter says, or just, I don't know, globalization, people moving around more. That's a whole other debate. But Carter, he's convinced it's intentional, a tactic, and like one group wins, the other loses, no in between.
Doesn't stop at the U.S. either.
Yeah.
He points to Canada, the Liberals bringing in, he says, Chinese and Indian voters. Great Britain, Labour doing the same, immigrants from India, Pakistan, Africa, like it's some global plot.
Exactly. A coordinated effort, in his view, by the left to like cling to power through sheer numbers. And it's all about promising benefits to these new arrivals, which he implies are paid for by, by the native population's taxes. He even throws in this phrase, Hurricane Helen atrocity, whatever that means, no context or anything.
Yeah, lost me on that one too. Getting pretty divisive. Another thing he keeps talking about, economics. Mass immigration, driving down wages, making housing more expensive, harder for the, quote, native population to just get by.
It's all tied to those two groups he's created, right? Like one group's economic anxieties are being ignored, maybe even exploited to help the other.
And for Carter, this all adds up to the fall of Western civilization, no less. White people a minority. Game over, he says.
Pretty bleak outlook. But agree or not, you can see how it taps into this fear some people have, right? Losing their culture, their place.
It is interesting, though, how he brings it back to violence. Says the left wins because of women voting, who he claims are unsuited to violence, and immigrants who supposedly wouldn't resist a more forceful takeover.
And this is where it gets really dicey. I mean, saying entire groups of people can't be violent based on stereotypes. Plus, advocating violence to achieve political goals, that's never okay.
And then he says the right wouldn't even need violence, really. Just enough scary men to say boo and the left folds. Kind of chilling.
Yeah, a little glimpse into, a pretty extreme mindset. Important to remember this isn't every right-leaning person, okay? This is one guy's very flawed and, frankly, dangerous take.
For sure. But he does contradict himself, doesn't he? Like doom and gloom, democracy's collapsing.
Yeah.
But then also says, right now, the right can still win elections. Just need enough of the native population on their side.
It's a weird part of his argument. He's saying it's not hopeless yet, right? Can still be turned around, but also kind of prepping for something more extreme if that fails.
He even talks about when the experiment in universal suffrage has run its course. Migrants gone, countries secure, and then they decide what to do with the politicians who, quote, tried to replace them.
Yeah, not exactly subtle, is he?
Sounds like a reckoning or something. Doesn't say violence, but
open to interpretation. And that's what's worrying. It's not just complaining about politics. It's hinting at something much more radical, even if he doesn't spell it out.
It is interesting, though. He's not saying get rid of democracy entirely. Still believes in voting, just with a very select group of people allowed, like trying to balance his like apocalyptic fears with, I don't know, keeping society running.
Right, and that's why picking apart these arguments is so important. Even if the conclusion is awful, we got to understand where it leads.
It's like he's taking bits and pieces of different systems, throughout history. The stuff he likes, throws out the rest, and it ends up, well, frankly, terrifying.
It really makes you think about how fragile these things are, Or democracies. We got to be talking about this stuff, even when it's hard.
Okay, so big picture. Carter's argument, it's all over the place. History, politics, and some really, inflammatory, even scary stuff.
Painting a picture of a world about to go up in flames, basically. And his solution's just as radical as it is disturbing.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
How do we square these, troubling ideas with actually living in a diverse democracy? For all his doom and gloom, the thing that gets me is Carter doesn't really say how we get to this better future of his, just kind of assumes violence is on the table.
Yeah, and that's what worries me the most, honestly. It's like he's saying the other side only understands force, not words. And that's a very, very dangerous message to be spreading.
Like he's forgotten that democracy, is messy, sure, lots of compromise. But it's about working things out not just who can throw their weight around.
Exactly. And protecting those values, those democratic values, it takes work. You got to think critically, be willing to talk, even argue, but actually trying to find common ground, you know?
Totally. One thing I keep coming back to, even if you think Carter's way off base.
Yeah.
Pointing at this tension that's real, right? Between majority rule and protecting the rights of those not in the majority.
Really important point. Easy to say his solution is crazy, but how do we balance those things? Especially with, like you said, demographics changing so fast. That's worth talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond just numbers, right? It's values, culture. What does it even mean to be part of a nation anymore, and who gets to decide? Carter kind of assumes we're all on the same page there, which we're not.
Totally. He keeps saying native populations this, foreign invaders that. But in a world where people have been moving around for like forever, who's to say who's really native? It's such a loaded term.
Totally loaded. Like throughout history, those words, native, foreign, they've been used to justify some really awful stuff. Exclusion, discrimination, you name it.
And that's why we have to be careful, examine these ideas, not just accept them, and be really wary of easy answers when the problems are this complex.
Okay, so we've waded through John Carter's, well, let's call it a unique perspective. Big picture, what's the takeaway, even if we don't have all the solutions figured out?
I think it's this. Carter sees everything as a battle, right? Us versus them. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if we actually looked for what we have in common, built something new where everyone feels like they belong, that their voice matters? It's hard, no doubt, but shouldn't that be the goal?
I'm with you on that. It's a good reminder, even with these dark, kind of scary idea floating around, there's always room for talking, for understanding each other better. That's how we build something better together.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that was a lot. Appreciate you taking this deep dive with us. A lot to unpack there.
Always a pleasure. And for everyone listening, well, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Take these ideas, talk about them, keep thinking critically. Thanks for listening.
All right, so